And because we cannot afford either to duck them or to get them wrong, that I want to make sure we go about the urgent task of cutting our deficit in a way that is open, responsible and fair. I want this government to carry out Britain's unavoidable deficit reduction plan in a way that tries to strengthen and unite our country at the same time. I've said before that as we deal with the debt crisis, we must take the whole country with us, and I mean it. George Osborne has said that our plans to cut the deficit must be based on the belief that we are all in this together, and he means it.
Well, David Cameron there explaining how we are all in it together, Martin.
Well, I think that's political spin. Clearly they want to cut the deficit. I mean, the fundamental thing I would say about that little clip there is the fundamental problem facing us isn't the deficit. The fundamental problem facing us is the economic crisis, which includes the deficit. The deficit is one of the aspects of the economic crisis. But what David Cameron there is conflating the whole economic crisis to the deficit, which is frankly economically illiterate, apart from anything else. But it's the kind of thing that people have bought into to a large extent because the population at large is largely economically illiterate, as I'm sure our guest will explain in a little while.
But, I mean, you're really swimming against the tide here, aren't you? Because this decision's already been made. The cuts are going to happen. It's just whereabouts they're going to happen, Martin.
Well, that's the way it's being presented.
We've just had a general election.
No, we've had a general election whereas the mandate for cuts is not at all clear, frankly. It's a rigged system, as we've said many times on this programme. It's actually rigged to allow the establishment in this country to retain control, and the establishment in this country very much includes the City of London. They want cuts, or some of them do. I think that they're all wrong. That in actual fact cuts at this moment will not help the economy. Then they won't. The really killer point is that it won't actually reduce the deficit. The cuts will crash the economy and increase the deficit, and then we'll be in a crashed economy with a bigger deficit. Going, oh, what do we do now? The Tories have simply not taken on board the fact that their neoliberal policies of the last 30 years are over and finished, and this kind of talk will be shown to be completely wrong within 18 months, I guarantee it.
OK, let's have another listen now, because we've got several of these clips, to Mr Cameron.
There are three simple reasons why we have to deal with the country's debts. One, the more the government borrows, the more it has to repay. The more it has to repay, the more lenders worry about getting their money back. And the more lenders start to worry, the less confidence there is in our economy.
Well, I agree that the deficit needs to be reduced to some extent, although everybody now accepts that some deficit is actually quite useful at this moment. I mean, for the last 30 years, we've been told that deficits are a no-no. Suddenly everybody's realised that they're actually essential, especially when you've got an economy that's going down. So you don't, in fact, want to decrease the deficit by too much. But clearly, we've got to do something to decrease the deficit. The obvious place to do that is through wealth taxes on those who've done, but maybe just a windfall tax on the wealthy classes who've done so well out of the last 30 years. Now, we're not hearing about that. We're hearing about cuts in adult care and all the things that we were talking about in the first part of the programme. Just stupidity, frankly, won't work.
Two, investors, people lending us this money, they don't have to put their money in Britain. They will only do so if they are confident that the economy is being run properly, and if confidence in our economy is hit, we run the risk of higher interest rates.
That is, of course, true, but it may be that by cutting the deficit, you actually crash the economy and confidence in the economy evaporates anyway. I mean, that's what may well happen here. They simply haven't taken on board that the times have changed. They're just coming out with the same old 1980s rhetoric, which is completely irrelevant to our changed circumstances. The financial system has imploded. That's what they need to put their mind to thinking about solving that problem. And as we were saying in the first part of the programme, it's who is it that's lending us this money? It wouldn't be David Cameron himself, would it, who's worth £5 million? Oh, what does he do with his £5 million? Well, he lends it to us, doesn't he? To us. And now he's saying, well, I won't get my money back, or people like him won't get their money back. Now, the fact of the matter is that we've got to have a massive redistribution of wealth. There's been malinvestment, which is what von Hayek and von Mises would call it. There's been no real profits made, but people are sitting on huge chunks of money which were based on nothing at all. That's not their money, that's our money, and we want it back. And that's how we're going to reduce the deficit. It's the only way.
Three, and the real human everyday reason that this is the most urgent problem facing Britain, is that higher interest rates hurt every family and every business in our land. They mean higher mortgage rates and lower employment. They mean that instead of your taxes going to pay for the things we all want, like schools and hospitals and police, your money, the money you work so hard for, is going on paying the interest on our national debt.
Do you want me to comment on that? That is essentially correct, and therefore we should not, in fact, be running up too much national debt. We need to run up some national debt because you need to prime the pump and keep the economy going. You don't want to crash it. But nevertheless, we've got to reduce the deficit. Now, the way to do that is to actually raise taxes on property and wealth and reform the monetary system so we don't get into this mess ever again. But it's time for the wealthy classes who've done so very well out of the last 30 years to get their checkbooks out instead of lecturing the rest of us about what we need to do. And the point is, it's not just unfair, it won't work.
The argument that we've consistently made for urgent action to start tackling the deficit this year and an accelerated plan for eliminating it over the years ahead has already been backed by the Bank of England and the Treasury's own analysis. It has been made more urgent still by the sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone over recent months. The global financial markets are no longer focusing simply on the financial position of the banks. They want to know that the governments that have supported the banks over the last 18 months are taking the actions to bring their own finances under control. And this weekend in South Korea, George Osborne received explicit backing from the G20 for the actions this government has already taken. Around the world, people and their governments are waking up to the dangers of not dealing with their debts. And Britain has got to be part of that international mainstream as well.
Well, the G20 are backing him, Martin.
Yes, well, I mean, we're basically being blackmailed by the financial sector. They collapsed 2 years ago. We bailed them out, and they're now saying, if you don't do as we say, we won't lend you any more of your own money that we've just paid in. We paid all this money over to them, and now they're making demands. This is all the wrong way round. But there's nothing is going to change without political change. I mean, we talked about the Monetary Reform Party earlier and why it wasn't particularly well known. I'm obviously not a supporter of the Monetary Reform Party. I'm a member of the Labour Party. Nothing will change until people realise that they've been hoodwinked and stolen and basically conned. We've got to face up to the fact that the financial sector is the root of the problem. They created the problem. That's where we've got to find the solution, not by cutting ordinary people's needs and wants. That's completely the wrong way about it. Now, at the moment, people are willing to buy all of this because we've been brainwashed since birth to believe that the system we live in is the only possible system. But very soon it's going to become obvious, even to stupid people, that the system is not working. And then, and only then probably, will the political pressure build for changes. And then when those changes are going to demand reforms in the way we do things. One of those reforms is going to be monetary reform.
OK, now let's have a listen to the final extract from David Cameron's speech earlier this week.
Greece stands as a warning of what happens to countries that lose their credibility or whose governments pretend that difficult decisions can somehow be avoided. Thankfully, this is a warning that's now focused the attention of the international community. That is why we believe there's only one option in front of us: to take immediate and decisive action. That's why we've already launched and completed an in-year spending review to save £6 billion of public spending. It's why shortly our new independent Office for Budget Responsibility will set out independent forecasts for both our growth and our borrowing, so that never again can this country sleepwalk into such a massive debt crisis. Our actions have already been noticed around the world, and I'm glad the G20 summit this weekend explicitly endorsed the decisions that we've taken. So this is the sober reality that I have to set out for the country today. The legacy left by the last government is terrible. The private sector has shrunk back to what it was over 6 years ago. Unless we act now, interest payments in 5 years' time could end up being higher than the sums we spend on our schools, on climate change, and on transport combined. Because the legacy we've been left is so bad, the measures that we need to deal with it will be unavoidably tough. But people's lives, and this is vital, people's lives will be worse unless we do something now. The cause of building a fairer society will be set back for years unless we do something now. We are not alone in this. Many countries around the world have been living beyond their means, and they too are having to face the music. And I make this promise to everyone in Britain. You will not be left on your own in this. We are all in this together, and we are going to get through this together. We will carry out Britain's unavoidable deficit reduction plan in a way that strengthens and unites our country. We're not doing this because we want to. We're not driven by some theory or some ideology. We are doing this as a government because we have to, driven by the urgent truth that unless we do so, people will suffer and our national interest will suffer too. But this government will not cut the deficit in a way that hurts those we most need to help, in a way that divides our country, or in a way that undermines the spirit and the ethos of our vital public services. Freedom, fairness, responsibility, those are the values that drive this government. They're the values that will drive our efforts to deal with our debts and to turn this country around. So yes, it will be tough. I make no bones about that. But we will get through this together, and Britain and all of us will come out stronger on the other side. Thank you for listening.
Well, it sounds he's fighting tough talk there from Mr. Cameron Martin. What is your reaction to it overall? Because he's saying there basically,
he sounds like the headmaster telling us that it's going to hurt him more than it hurts us. And of course, when he says that that this is all going to be very fair and reasonable, well, one thing we could do, for example, is Council tried and get rid of our aircraft carriers, withdraw from Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq. Oh, we're not going to do any of that. No. So where are we going to make these cuts? We were talking with Derek, the Labour councillor, earlier. I'll tell you where the cuts are going to be. They're going to be in adult social care. That's where they're going to be. That's what's going to happen. And of course, it won't even reduce the deficit, because when you cut like that, you're actually cutting demand in your own economy. It means you put people out of work. They don't pay any more taxes. You have to pay them benefits. This is what happened in the 1980s. They didn't even reduce the deficit.
But Cameron's saying he's going to be reducing the benefits bill.
Well, how's he going to do that? And if don't forget that the benefits bill is what keeps the economy up. Yeah, once you put people out of work, if you don't give them a benefit, then you've taken their demand out of the economy entirely, and you really are on a downward spiral. This sounds plausible. And it sounds plausible to many people because from birth we're brought up to believe that the system works in a certain kind of way and we've all just got to work within that framework. It's just wrong. The financial sector is the reason why we've got a deficit. It's the bankers that are living beyond their means, not the ordinary people. Now what we should do is basically have a windfall. First of all, get some fraud investigations going, because a lot of people would argue that CBOs are all fraud.
There are fraud investigations going on.
There are, but
Goldman Sachs,
well, indeed, but they're not being pursued with sufficient determination. A lot of these people should be in prison and their money should be entirely taken off. Never mind raising taxes on them, we're taking all of it off you. That's the first thing. And the savings and loans scandal in the 1980s, hundreds of people went to prison and all their assets were confiscated. That's not happened this time. Now, this is where we need to be getting tough, and talking tough is with the financial sector. We don't actually need a lot of what they do. We could easily manage without it. Many successful countries do not have a huge, bloated financial sector like Britain. Now, we've got to get to grips with this, and these people are so-called invisible, untouchable. We've got to get to grips with the immediate crisis, which means taking the money off them and using it to make sure that we keep our level of demand up, and then we've got to reform the whole setup. And that's where things like monetary reform and other measures would come in, because we don't want to get back into this mess ever again. If we cleaned up the mess now and allow them to go back to doing things the way they were before 2008, we'll get back straight into the mess again almost immediately. So we've got to act. This is the chance, a once-in-a-generation chance, once-in-a-lifetime chance to actually do the right things properly. But this is all marching in the wrong direction. We are lions led by donkeys. They don't know which direction to go in. They're telling us to go and attack the machine guns. They're wrong. We need to get our heads down and go around the side.
Bob Wellham, can I bring you in again from the Money Reform Party? Can you shed any light on this dispute, really, between the Conservative and Martin's old Labour point of view? Is this something you're familiar with?
I'm afraid not, Tony. I'm more of a theoretician. I'd like to introduce your listeners to perhaps different ways of thinking about money.
I think one of the problems is that a lot of the jargon that's used about economics is actually really quite difficult to get your heads around, and it's almost like an act of faith.
Particularly there's an ambiguity between the words credit and money. a conventional economist will insist that the banks extend credit to the rest of us, and we go away and do our business and earn, well, again, I'm having to use the word money because it comes naturally. We earn these numbers back and then we pay the banks back. They settle their accounts daily through what's called base money, which is the numbers that they use with respect to the central bank, the Bank of England.
Because this is the first time I've realised that there's maybe different sorts of money around.
But you've heard of M1, M2, M3. I mean, that's economist jargon, but the different measures of the money supply. Yeah?
Base money, which is issued by the Bank of England, we don't see it except in the form of physical cash. Now, physical cash, notes and coins, is only less than 3% of what's called the broad money supply, which is the money that you and I use to buy and sell stuff, to pay our taxes, etc., etc. The Money Reform Party would like to do away with this two-tier system and have just one form of money. Let's call it plain money, which was a phrase coined by James Robertson, a venerable British money reformer. Do look him up on Google if you are interested. We would like to move to this unitary system of money where you, as a citizen or as a business, you will own any money in your bank account. It will be your money. At the moment, the numbers, the money, the credit in your bank account, again, there's different words for it, is the bank's obligation to pay you. It's not real money in the sense that the base money is real money.
So are you saying that there's a difference between the money you're spending using your debit card, for example, and money that you have as cash in your pocket?
Yes.
Because it's interchangeable, surely.
It is interchangeable, yes, and that's part of the difficulty in seeing through it. Let's call it the electronic money you have perhaps in your savings account. You can look at it in your passbook, or you can go online and see the numbers there. Where did that come from? How did it get into circulation? You can spend it just as well as you can spend cash. You can spend cash at the corner shop or the pub and so on. You can spend this electronic money through your credit card, your debit card, etc., and it jumps from account to account as business proceeds. Where did it come from? There's 97% of our money is in this form. If you look back where it came from, well, it got into circulation because somebody, somewhere, at some time in the past, borrowed it from the bank. Maybe a mortgage, a personal loan, etc. And then it circulates round and we all compete to get hold of more of it, mainly to pay back what we borrowed from the banking system.
Okay, now just to go back to something we were talking about earlier, which is the Bank of England and the shares in it. Are you aware of who owns the Bank of England, whether it's private or public? Because there seems to be a bit of a dispute about that.
I believe it's 100% public owned. It was nationalised after the Second World War, and I think technically the Treasury owns it, or Secretary of the Treasury, something like that. I'm not sure. But it's certainly publicly owned, yes.
OK, now, on Tuesday this week, the Chancellor George Osborne announced that he was going to consult everyone in Britain about where we all think the cuts should fall. Well, you can't be fairer than that, can you?
I would say that actually the level of public expenditure should not be cut. It should probably be increased. I would cut certain aspects of public expenditure. For example, Trident, obviously ID cards, they're on the way out anyway. But you wouldn't, if you saved that money, you wouldn't want to just hold it back. You'd then want to spend it on other things. You don't want to be actually cutting the level of demand in the economy. This is the fundamental error that the Conservatives are making. If you cut the level of demand in the economy goes down, and then people pay less taxes because they're out of work, and so on and so forth. So you don't actually. It's like anorexia. Yeah, you just keep throwing up the stuff you're eating, and you get thinner and thinner and thinner. What we need to do is fatten ourselves up a bit and look after ourselves. Now, if we can't afford that, then we've got to look at who's got the money. And various people were saying, well, there is money in the society. We know it's there, and those people really have done very, very well out of the last generation of economic policy. Nobody's saying they should lose all their money, apart from the fraudsters, but they've got to pay up now. They've done very well. It's all a mess. They're responsible. They've got to pay up. It's polluter pays. It's like the Bullingdon Club have smashed up the pub, and now the bill has got to be paid. That's all there is to it.
Now, a couple of people there were talking about the expenses scandal last year and explaining that actually, this is one area where there's been profligacy in the past, and there's got to be cuts there, and government in expenses for MPs, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean,
and possibly a reduction in pay for MPs.
Well, that may well be so. But if people think that there was more money spent investigating the MPs' expenses scandal than the MPs that actually scammed out of the system. So if people think we're going to save the economy by getting MPs to bicycle to work, then they're living in cloud cuckoo land. The kind of amounts of money we're talking about are astronomical. People can get their heads round a £4,000 duck pond that wasn't even claimed for. But the idea that the banks have run off with £4 trillion, they can't get their heads round that, so they don't even think about it. Well, it's a confidence trick that's being pulled on the population here. The real fraud and fault is in the financial sector. It's not in the public sector at all, and that's what's got to be dealt with, and that involves reform of the monetary system, as we were talking about earlier. I mean, the fact is that most money is not actually under the control of the government at all. It's lent into existence by the private banks, and they get a fat fee for doing so. They are in the position of printing money, not the government, and it's not right. It's got to change. That's why we got into the mess.
Now let me bring Bob Wellham from the Money Reform Party back in again here. Bob, you were saying while we were listening to that that actually more money is borrowed from corporations rather than sort of created by the Bank of England. How does that work?
Well, let me tell a little story that I hope your listeners can understand this. It appealed to me when I first started learning about this stuff. Imagine a society that has not yet invented money, it just barters, swapping chickens for goats and so on. And then some bright spark comes up with the idea of a universal means of exchange, which is like money, quantified purchasing power, and they decide how to implement it. Well, they all get together and say, well, let's have these tokens. It doesn't matter what they are. They don't have any intrinsic value, but we'll all have confidence in them and use them to trade our goods and services. Might be seashells or notched sticks or whatever. And you can see that that's a common sense view of money, and it would work perfectly well. And in fact, it's just like our physical cash that we use to buy and sell small-scale stuff. Now, the difference is that one person then comes along, let's call him Mr. Banker, and he says, well, yeah, these tokens are fine that you guys are using, but I've got some tokens that I'd prefer that you used. Here they are. I've got a big chest of them there. We won't run out of them. Now, the thing about these tokens is I'm going to lend them to you. I'm going to lend each one of you 100 of them to start with, and then you can trade just like you're trading now with your own tokens. The difference is at the end of a year, I want back 105 from each of you, not just 100. That's called interest, and I deserve that because I'm supplying you with the money. This can work only if, at the end of the year, you'll have realised that there's not enough tokens in circulation now to pay the banker all of it back, so he has to lend more to keep up the money supply in society so that the economy can continue to proceed and hopefully flourish. This is the system we're in now. The money we use to conduct our business has been lent to us by a private money issuing banking sector.
So are you talking about the coins in my pocket, for example? They haven't been lent to me, have they?
No, they haven't. They're issued by the state. Well, you own them. Indeed, you do. Yes, they're not. Well, they are a contract between you and the central bank, but the central bank is owned by all of us. It's the state issuing money. It's the collective of all the people involved issuing their own money for their own purposes. That's fine. Money's a great thing. It makes everything much more efficient. No problem. What I think the problem is, and what the Money Reform Party thinks the problem is that the bulk of our money, the supply of it to the rest of us to conduct our business, has been captured by quite a small vested interest minority, the commercial banking section, which is an incredibly profitable business to get into, because what you're essentially doing is supplying the rest of the people with numbers that they can use to trade with. It doesn't really cost you that much to produce numbers. But if you can demand bigger numbers back from the people every so often, and that's called interest, you're onto a real winner. To my mind, this explains why the bankers, the financial sector, do so very well generally. They have the best cars and the best houses.
But hang on a minute, they were about to go bankrupt a year and a half ago, weren't they?
Yes, what I think's happened is they've overplayed their hand. It's such a great business to be in. The more you expand the money supply, the more profit you make, because more or less every pound out there in circulation, you've lent it to somebody at interest. So they got a bit carried away with this, I think, and expanded the money supply too much. And now it's expanded so much, and it's expanded into or through lending that can't be repaid, subprime mortgages, for example, that the banks are essentially bankrupt.